What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we are going to be going through my top 24 rookies for 2025 rookie drafts as it sits right now, kind of how I'm viewing these guys as if we were going to be drafting in our rookie drafts here today. Obviously, there's still a lot of information that we need to find out, landing spots, draft capital, pretty much all of the important stuff, but I still feel like it's a good exercise to kind of show you guys how I'm viewing the current 2025 rookie class and how we should be approaching these rookies, maybe in the trade room, and how we're going to be looking at these picks as we head into the NFL draft here next month. But with that being said, I don't want to waste too much more time on an intro. Let's hop right into this tier maker and let's start talking about these players. All right, so as you can see, we got the tier maker pulled up on the screen. I got 7 tiers. I've tiered them how I view them to potentially be drafted in your 2025 rookie draft. So you see we got those early first, mid first, late first, and then early seconds, mid seconds, late seconds. So let's kick it off. There is one guy in a tier of his own. I think everybody knows who it is. It's Ashton Jeanty. To me, this is a running back prospect that's been as good as any of these running back prospects over the last couple of years. You look at Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, what they've done in the NFL, and how we viewed them as prospects coming into the NFL draft. I think Jeanty should be considered similar to those players. Maybe not as good as Bijan, maybe not as good as Gibbs. In my opinion, he's just behind those guys, but I would view him higher than I viewed Breece Hall. I'd view him higher than I viewed Jonathan Taylor and some of those other big names that we've had in the last decade. To me, Jeanty, this is a player who's going to get top 15 draft capital, maybe even top 10 type of draft capital, and he's going to be a workhorse running back one from day one as soon as he steps into the NFL. Whether he is going to be a home run at the next level, obviously that's going to have to come when he plays, but I think he's about as good of a bet as anybody, and if I had the 101, I would only be looking at this player and this player only. So Jeanty is in a tier of his own. But as far as the early first go, I do think that we do have about 3 players in this tier. To me, it's going to be Cam Ward, Omarion, Hampton, and McMillan. This is kind of the next tier of prospects for me, and at least how I'm going to be expecting them to be drafted here in the NFL draft as well. I think Cam Ward is pretty damn close to being the 101 in the NFL draft. If not, he's going to be a top 5 pick regardless. I can't see him really getting past 2. At this point, he has all of the tools that you want to see out of a quarterback, some rushing upside, a big arm. I think in Superflex formats, it's going to be hard for a lot of people to pass on Cam Ward, assuming he is the #1 overall pick and the tools that he has. So I think he's going to be a very early first round pick. Now, if you have your quarterback situation figured out, I do think Omarion Hampton is in play. This is a player that I think has a lot of talent. He's a very well-rounded running back, can do pretty much everything that you need on the football field. Pass pro, catching the ball out of the backfield, running between the tackles. The analytical profile is off the charts. I think just like Jeanty, this is a player who is going to be very safe, and he is almost guaranteed to probably come in almost immediately as a top 12, top 15 running back in Dynasty rankings. So to me, I would be using an early first. And like I said, if you had that quarterback situation figured out and you don't want to draft Cam Ward, I could see Omarion Hampton, assuming he gets into a good landing spot, end up going 102 overall in those rookie drafts right behind Ashton Jeanty. And now McMillan, to me, he is the wide receiver 1 in this class. I think he has the highest upside out of pretty much all of these guys. I think there is going to be some people that are a little bit lower on him. A lot of this, I think, is coming from him not working out of the combine, but I think we need to put that to bed. When he went out to his pro day, he did work out. He looked pretty good. To me, I'm not too worried about him not working out of the combine. I think this is a player who probably comes off the board as the wide receiver 1 if we're not including that cornerback / wide receiver in Travis Hunter, but I do think that McMillan is about as good of a prospect as you can get. He's not a slam dunk type of prospect, but if I was drafting a wide receiver in this draft, it would be McMillan coming off the board for me here as the wide receiver 1 in the class. So that kind of takes us to the mid first. The mid first round is where there's going to be a ton of talent, I think, on the board. Really, as we get all the way into the early seconds, I feel like there's still a ton of talent on the board in this draft. But in the mid first, I have 4 guys. I'm really going with TreVeyon Henderson here, Quinshon, Judkins, Tyler Warren, and Shedeur Sanders. Now, the 2 running backs out of Ohio State, Hendo and Judkins, I think these are smash running backs as well. These guys should come in and be fantasy relevant day 1, and I think that they both should probably be drafted in the 2nd round of the NFL draft. Now, obviously last year these guys split the backfield, but Henderson, he has a ton of juice. He's super explosive. He's an electric playmaker in my opinion, and Judkins, he can kind of do it all. Judkins was kind of getting slept on, I feel like, in the pre-draft process before the NFL combine, but his combine workout, his RAS score, his measurables, the analytical profile, all of those things for Judkins, they check the boxes. I think there might even be an argument that Judkins, if he gets really good draft capital and he lands in a good landing spot like Pittsburgh or something like that, he could jump into that early first tier where McMillan and Omarion Hampton are. But overall, I think Hendo, he's a player that I've been very, very excited about, and I love the tape, so I'm super excited about Henderson as well. I think he's going to be a beast. Speaking of beasts, I also think Tyler Warren is a monster. When you're looking at tight end prospects, he is not Brock Bowers, but he is probably the next type of tier under. When I look at the last couple of years of tight end prospects, think of guys like Laporta and Kincaid and Michael Mayer and some of these other guys that we've had that we've been really excited about in rookie drafts, I think Tyler Warren is a better tight end prospect than them. He's not Brock Bowers, but don't let that underestimate how good that Tyler Warren actually is. I think he can do everything. He reminds me a lot of George Kittle when he's on the football field. He lined up in the backfield at times. He's been out wide. He plays deep. He has good hands, contested catch. I think this is a player that's probably going to find himself in the top 10, top 15 of the NFL draft. He's going to be a very early pick into the tight end position. That's going to be a smash in your tight end premium leagues. I think Tyler Warren has an argument where if you need tight end, you could take him at the top of this tier as the 5th overall player in this draft, but Tyler Warren, to me, he's a monster. So Shedeur Sanders, he's the other guy in this tier, and I think he has to be in this tier still regardless. The situation with the New York Giants is a little bit concerning just because I feel like that's one of the landing spots that had a lot of buzz for Shedeur Sanders, and I would like to see him potentially be with a guy like Malik Neighbors. But you do look at these teams, the Tennessee Titans at 1, the Cleveland Browns at 2, and you could still see a situation where Shedeur gets that high draft capital. I don't know if he's going to get that. If he doesn't get that draft capital, I do think he's going to fall into the late first type of territory, but for me, I'm still hanging on to that mid first type of range, because when you're looking at Superflex leagues and you get a guy who gets that top 10 type of draft capital, I do think you have to put him up there. So Shedeur Sanders, I like the prospect, accurate, fine quarterback. I don't think he's special by any means, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think this is a guy who can be a high-end game manager, kind of similar to what Jared Goff has been in years past, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for fantasy football. We've seen Goff be fantasy football relevant. You just have to have the right team and the right situation around him. Let's go on to these late first. The late first, to me, consists of a lot of the wide receivers in this class. I got 4 players in this tier. It's going to be Travis Hunter coming in there, Emeka Egbuka, I got Luther Burden, and then I got Kaleb Johnson in here as well. I kind of want to talk about all of these wide receivers because draft capital, landing spot, they can change this tier up a little bit, but the way that I'm viewing it right now is I probably view Travis Hunter, assuming he plays 85-90% of his snaps as a wide receiver, as the wide receiver 2 in this class. He is very, very talented when he is playing that wide receiver position. Obviously, he's very talented at the cornerback position as well, but we don't really care about that for fantasy football. So for me, if he goes to a spot like the New England Patriots, where he could go in and beat Drake May's number 1, number 2 next to Stephon Diggs, however you want to cut it, and have him be an elite playmaker on offense, I think that would make him very exciting for rookie drafts. So he's a player that I'm keeping my eye on. I'm starting to lean a little bit more as to him playing the wide receiver position at the NFL and less cornerback than he played in college. And obviously that's kind of what we want for rookie drafts. Maybe that's a little bit of hopium, but at the end of the day, I do think that he is a better wide receiver than he is a cornerback, and maybe that's going to be seen by some NFL teams. Now, looking at the other guys, Emeka Egbuka, I love him, very solid route runner. I think he is very polished, a very good pro. Pretty much when I'm watching his tape, I feel like I'm watching a pro wide receiver, and that should probably be known when you're looking at a lot of these Ohio State guys. They've been known for putting pro wide receivers into the NFL. I think Emeka Egbuka is one of the next guys probably going to play kind of that big slot, that layup type of target, similar to guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown that we've seen in years past. Not to say that Egbuka is Amon-Ra St. Brown, but he can play a very similar role to that. I also see a little bit of Chris Godwin in his game. I like what I see out of Egbuka, and I think he's going to land in a sweet spot there in the late teens, early 20s, where he might find himself in a situation like the Houston Texans, where he reunites with CJ Stroud and he ends up being that number 2 wide receiver next to Nico Collins. I think that would be a great spot for Egbuka. Burden to me is super explosive. I love Burden's tape. Obviously the tape in 2024 wasn't as good, but I don't feel like the quarterback play was great from Mizzou. I don't feel like his usage was the right type of usage for him at that level. And when I'm looking at Burden, I kind of remind myself going back to 2023 and seeing some of that tape and saying, yeah, this is kind of the guy that I view him as, and not so much that 2024 version. Not that there isn't things to like on the 2024 tape, but overall, I think Burden, he's a player that is going to probably surprise people. I think he's being a little bit slept on, but still at the end of the day, I think right now he's coming in as my wide receiver 4 in this class, and somebody that I still think you can view as a wide receiver 2 probably in fantasy football in dynasty leagues over the next couple of seasons. So Kaleb Johnson is the only running back in this tier. He's kind of the tier break for me. After you get outside of these top 5 running backs, I think there is some question marks about these guys. Kaleb Johnson might have some question marks as well, but when I'm looking at him compared to other backs that we'll talk about later, like Scatabo and Dylan Sampson and DJ Giddens and Tootin and all these other guys, I think Kaleb Johnson's just on a different level than those guys. I think he's a guy who's probably going to be closer to round 3 draft capital, and if he gets that round 3, it's going to depend on the depth chart and the landing spot, but he's a guy who I view as probably next of kin when you're looking at a running back room. They might have a guy there already, but when you have Kaleb Johnson come in, he can be the future of the running back room. I I don't actually think a bad situation for Kaleb Johnson would be round 3 maybe to the Los Angeles Chargers, and he kind of starts the year behind Najee Harris and then ends up taking over that backfield long term. And I think that would get a lot of people excited about Kaleb Johnson. He can do pretty much everything as well. A very good analytical profile as well. Checks all the measurables boxes, all of the workload boxes, everything you want. So overall, nothing too concerning about Kaleb Johnson. And he comes in for me as the last guy in that late first type of territory. Now, the early seconds here, these are the last tier of players that I feel super confident that they can come in and be fantasy relevant pretty early on in their careers. I'm going to put Matthew Golden here at the top of this tier, followed by Jaxson Dart and Colston Loveland. So this tier for me, Golden, a wide receiver that had a really good combine. People are very excited about Golden right now. I think he is a good wide receiver. I'm not necessarily at this time seeing special qualities out of Matthew Golden, and I think people are going to say that I'm sleeping on Golden, and I get it. At the end of the day, I think he's a player that's still going to come in, even the people who are very high on him, as a late first type of player at best. So even if you want to be really high on Matthew Golden, I think he's a late first type of player as well. I kind of debated between late first and early seconds with him, but right now I just view him as a guy that I am probably taking as the 13th guy off the board. Now, he's a pretty good route runner. I think this is a player who can win at the next level. I think he's probably going to be a guy who plays as a good number 2 wide receiver instead of a elite wide receiver 1. And I don't even necessarily know if Egbuka or Burden or Hunter or those guys are going to be elite wide receiver 1s either, but I can at least see a path, a little bit better of a path for those guys based on their current profiles. Golden, to me, I don't want to sound like I'm down. I'm just trying to explain, that I feel like he's a good wide receiver, not an elite wide receiver. And to me, I'm just viewing him as the wide receiver 5 in this class currently. And that's just kind of how you cut it. And at the end of the day, Matthew Golden comes in for me as a early second round pick. Still a good player though. I still feel confident in him. Jaxson Dart, I think this is a player who's going to sneak into the late first, early second. If he's not a late first round pick, he's going to be an early second round pick. He's got all of the things that you want to see: a big arm, he can make the throws, he's fairly accurate. I think this is a player who is going to be somewhat reminiscent of Will Levis types, Drew Lock, when Drew Lock was with the Denver Broncos there for that couple of years, where you were getting the exciting sideline rapping and some of the other stuff. You guys know what I'm talking about. Jaxson Dart's going to kind of fall into that mold of player to me. Maybe he can get with a good coach at the NFL level and evolve into a consistent starter, but at the end of the day, I think this is a player who's going to come in and be fantasy relevant for a short period of time, 2-3 years maybe, at the NFL level once he gets his opportunity as a starter, and then he's probably going to be a guy that they move on from and go somewhere else. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at these Jaxson Dart types of quarterbacks in Dynasty, it's hard not to draft them, because when they do become fantasy football relevant there for a short period of time, they oftentimes bump up to that late first type of category, and you can get a first round pick for them eventually, even if you're just trading down the road. So maybe Jaxson Dart's a guy that you're picking in the early second. He gets the starting job, he looks good for a couple of games, he's exciting. You can then move him and flip him for a 26 first or a 27 first, and then you can kind of get a little bit of extra value, or you just keep Jaxson Dart, who was a value there in the second round. And then the last player that I do believe is probably going to be a first round pick here is Colston Loveland. Colston Loveland, if he gets in the right situation, I think can be very fantasy football relevant. He is a good possession type of tight end. This is another player that I would view somewhat similar to the Kincaid type of tight end as we saw in years past, and I think this is a guy in a tight end premium format. You really can't let him get past this early second, because after him at the tight end position, there's very few guys that I think are sure things, and I think Colston Loveland and Tyler Warren are sure things. Obviously, there is a pretty big tier break between the two of them, because I have Tyler Warren as a mid first and Colston Loveland as an early second, but at the end of the day, Loveland should land in the right situation and he should be fantasy relevant, and I wouldn't mind seeing him land somewhere like the Colts, where he could be one of the pass catching options there for a quarterback in Indianapolis. Now, let's go to the mid seconds. To me, this is the largest tier right now. I think there's a lot that still needs to be figured out between these guys, and once you get to the mid seconds, to me, this is where the draft capital and the landing spot is going to play a pretty massive role in how I view these players. But as prospects today, without knowing this information, I think there's about 5 or 6. Actually, I think there's 6 players in this tier that I'm looking at. Cam Scatterboo is coming in there for me, Dylan Sampson. I also have Trey Harris, I have Jaden Higgins, DJ Giddens, and Baishal Tootin. That is the tier for me. I'm viewing Scatterbo and Sampson as very, very solid running backs that can be relevant at the next level. Both things have different things that you like out of them. Scatterbo, to me, he's kind of a guy that you can play all around. He's a good receiving back. He has the ability to run between the tackles. He has all of these things that you like out of him. I think NFL teams are going to like him too. I think he's more so a guy that's going to come in as a second back and maybe work his way into the RB1 one role. I think the same thing can be said for Dylan Sampson. Dylan Sampson has a ton of juice. He's super explosive. I think he has a lot of things to like as well about his profile. Trey Harris and Jaden Higgins to me are guys that I think can come in and play that X wide receiver role, maybe be the wide receiver 2 on an offense next to somebody else. Harris is a big play guy. Higgins has a lot to like in his game. Both of them are pretty good after the catch at the contested catch point, and I think both of these guys can be pretty fantasy relevant at the wide receiver position for a class that's just not that great at the wide receiver position after you get outside of those top 5 wide receivers. Now, Giddens and Tootin are also 2 other guys that I think can come in as depth running backs on a depth chart and then find their way into more important roles. I just don't feel as confident in Giddens and Tootin to become overall running back 1s on their depth chart over time as I do Scatterbo and Sampson. So that's why you see those guys at the top of the tier and Giddens and Tootin at the back of the tier. To me, those guys are very explosive running backs. Giddens has a ton to like. His analytical profile is insane, but the draft capital for these 2 is a little bit hard to predict right now. Maybe they land in day 2, but I think they're more likely 4th round running backs, which then does kind of push them towards the back of that mid-second round, maybe closer to that late second. And maybe the more that I'm talking about it, maybe we need to pull those guys down to that late second round and just have that be a larger tier. But I do view those guys as more confident picks than I do these late second round picks. So let's move on to the late second rounds. To me, there's 3 wide receivers here. It's Jalen Noel, Alec Iomanner, and Jalen Royals. To me, this is where the class really loses a lot of the luster. And not that these are bad players. I don't think these are bad players, but I think there's a lot here where you lose the confidence in the draft pick. Noel, Royals, and Iomanner, I think all of these guys are very decent wide receivers, but there's still a lot to work on in their profiles. Noel can come in and kind of be a wide receiver 3 for an offense. I think he can play some kick and punt return. He's a good route runner, a savvy route runner, but I think he's a guy who's going to need some volume to be relevant. And not only is he going to need the volume, he's a little bit undersized as well. So he's probably going to have to find the right situation that can get the best out of his skill set. Iomanner, to me, he's a guy that's a very decent wide receiver. He can play that long ball. He's a good contested catch wide receiver. You've seen there's a couple highlights where he's had some one-handed catches in the end zone. I think this is a player who has a little bit to learn as a route runner. He needs to improve that route tree overall, but I think he's a guy who could be a wide receiver 2 in an offense in the right situation. His analytical profile as well, the measurables, they do check some of the boxes that we want to see, so there is some things to like there as well. But the tape, it just lacks some explosion on it, and so I came away from his tape kind of looking at this as this is a solid wide receiver, but he's not a great wide receiver by any means. So that's kind of how I'm viewing him at the moment. And Royals, I think, is the most all-around wide receiver of this group. To me, he probably just hasn't played against the best competition. When you look at Royals being there at Utah State, I think he can kind of do it all. He's a good route runner. He has the size, he has the measurables, the analytic profile. He saw the target share at college. These are things that we want to see them check the boxes for when you're looking at their analytical profile. And so he does check those boxes for me. The tape is good enough for me as well. There's definitely some things to like. I just don't believe, again, I feel like I keep saying this about the class, and I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer about the wide receivers in this class, but once you do get past Matthew Golden, there's a lot of question marks, I think, about pretty much everybody. So Jalen Royals, to me, a good, decent wide receiver. If he finds the right situation, you probably like him. But at this point in time, you know, really when we're looking at these rankings, pretty much everybody mid-second and late second, I think the draft capital of the landing spot is going to shake this up a ton. For me, that early seconds and above, it does feel pretty solidified at this point. I don't think really the draft capital is going to change too much. I think most of those guys have pretty easily projectable draft capital situations. And so barring anything crazy, I think most of those guys are set in stone. But right now, this is kind of how I'm viewing the top 24. And overall, this is kind of how I'd be drafting these guys if we were doing rookie drafts today with the information that we have. But all right, guys, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you did enjoy today's video. I've been having some problems with the camera. I don't know why. Hopefully it's not too bad and it's still easy to follow along. I noticed there's a little bit of lag on the camera right now. I didn't notice it as much when I had the screen recording up, but hopefully it's still good. I'm trying to figure this out. I'm sorry. It's been the last video and this video that it's kind of been like this, but it is what it is. Still got to get you the content regardless. But if you did enjoy today's video, go ahead and hit that like button for me. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Make sure you go join our Discord. But with all of that being said, I have nothing else for you today. I'm gonna fix this camera issue. I'm sorry. But I'll see you on the next one. Till then, peace out.